Thus, pure reason, which at first seemed to promise us nothing less than the extension of our cognition beyond the limits of experience, is found, when thoroughly examined, to contain nothing but regulative principles, the virtue and function of which is to introduce into our cognition a higher degree of unity than the understanding could of itself. These principles, by placing the goal of all our struggles at so great a distance, realize for us the most thorough connection between the different parts of our cognition, and the highest degree of systematic unity. But, on the other hand, if misunderstood and employed as constitutive principles of transcendent cognition, they become the parents of illusions and contradictions, while pretending to introduce us to new regions of knowledge. Immanuel Kant. I have spoken at length now for several weeks or even months about Kant's theoretical philosophy and about his critique when it comes to the faculty of cognition, as he lines out in the Critique of Pure Reason. This is going to be a sort of conclusion. So, if there is anything in this lecture that you don't understand, then I recommend first listening to the previous lectures, because if you have listened to them, I think everything I say here should be clear. Kant's question in the Critique of Pure Reason was the question, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? And his reason for asking that question was the state of metaphysics in his time, or his discontent with the state of metaphysics at that time. Because one needs to understand that the Critique of Pure Reason is not written in a vacuum. Kant didn't just one day set out and decide to criticize reason and to revolutionize philosophy. Rather, the Critique of Pure Reason is a response to 18th century metaphysics, mainly to the metaphysics that were most prominent in their time in Germany. That is the metaphysics of the rationalistic Leibniz-Wolffian school. And in their metaphysics, they had, as fields of metaphysics, rational psychology, rational cosmology, rational theology. And amongst other things, amongst other questions that they discussed and tried to solve, according to Kant, these mainly, or most importantly, dealt with three ideas, which are necessary ideas of our reason, ideas that concern every human being and that every human being who reflects will come up with. And these are the ideas of our soul and its immortality, of free will, and of God. And the metaphysicians of the time believed that they could say something about each of those ideas, that they could prove them, that they could prove the immortality of our soul, that they could prove us being free, that they could prove there being a God. And if that is at all possible, then it can only be possible through synthetic judgments a priori. That much should be clear. Because metaphysics is a science about the supersensual. It is a science which only makes judgments a priori, because it goes beyond experience. and all judgments from experience are judgments a posteriori. So if you can prove these three ideas, you can only prove them a priori. And also, these judgments would have to be synthetic judgments a priori, because all you're doing in an analytic judgment is, well, analyzing a concept. You analyze, you examine what you already know. Kant also calls them explaining judgments, because they just explain to us, they bring more clarity into what we are already thinking. Through analytic judgments, you could analyze what you mean by immortality of the soul, what freedom means, what you have to think when thinking God. But through analytic judgments, you cannot expand your knowledge, so you cannot prove the existence of these things. So therefore, if metaphysics in that sense is to be possible at all, and if the claims of the metaphysicians of those times should hold any weight, that they can prove those three ideas, it can only be through synthetic judgments a priori. And that is exactly why Kant asked the question, how are such synthetic judgments a priori possible? And the dialectic part of the critique of pure reason, about which I now talked in the previous 4 lectures, the dialectic part constitutes, in a way, the very core of that critique and the very core of Kant's project and the reason why he wrote that critique. Maybe today, when we today read that book, it's maybe not so clear. It can seem to us now to be a sort of appendix and not the most important part of the work. Maybe nowadays we are more interested in what Kant has to say about time and space as forms of viewing, or what he has to say about the 12 categories as the necessary categories, the necessary concepts through which all our thinking is happening. But you have to realize that for Kant, these things are more preliminary. They, as important as they are, as revolutionary as they are, as much influence as they had on philosophers coming after Kant, still they serve a certain purpose in the critique of pure reason. They lay the groundworks to find out how synthetic judgments a priori are possible and where their limits are. But then they get applied in the part on the dialectic. The dialectic is the part where Kant deals with the metaphysics of his time and with its 3 fields of rational psychology, cosmology, and theology. And for sure, some of the questions he deals with there, they might be quite scholarly. They might not be the questions that are hotly debated nowadays, like when he discusses whether the world is made up of small indivisible parts of monads, or whether the world can infinitely be divided. But it is important to understand the context and to understand the goal of a text. And there is one issue that often occurs when reading older texts, not just, by the way, when it comes to philosophy, also when it comes to other texts. It is, for example, a big issue when it comes to religious texts like the Bible or the Quran. Texts are not written in a vacuum. They usually respond to something. They usually take part in the discourse of their time. And to us who come later, that discourse, that time, the things that text responded to, are often lost, or at least unknown, unless we are experts. And that can sort of distort a text. That can lead to us reading a text differently from how it was intended and how its first readers would have read it. Well, what Kant is saying is that synthetic judgments a priori, they are indeed possible. They have to be possible even. Or otherwise we couldn't even make synthetic judgments a posteriori. Otherwise we couldn't even make experience. But what he is saying is that they are only possible when they relate to experience. So synthetic judgments a priori, they are possible because we have these categories, these 12 categories that Kant gives us in his table of categories. So we have certain pure intellectual concepts that we don't get out of experience. And that means with them we can judge a priori. We can combine them, connect them, synthesize them, that is the synthesis, without needing experience to do so. But the thing is, the judgments that we come up with that way, they could be completely empty judgments. I don't know if the connection I make between two concepts a priori, if that is just something in my head, something that I thought up, or if it says anything true about reality. I only know that when I make a synthetic judgment, so when I make such a connection between concepts in time and space as my forms of viewing. And that is exactly what Kant does in his transcendental philosophy. Transcendental meaning stepping over the bounds of experience, so making judgments a priori, making judgments that don't come out of experience, but still they are judgments about experience, about the conditions of the possibility of even making experience. So they are judgments about sort of the basic framework, the basic, most general laws of nature in which all our experience has to happen. Such synthetic judgments a priori are possible. And therefore, mathematics as a pure science of reason is possible because it makes synthetic judgments a priori, but only in time when it comes to arithmetic, or space when it comes to geometry. So that means that we know that its judgments are true, that its judgments have a certain reality and are not just chimeras. We know that because they apply to everything which we could ever perceive in time and space. They don't go beyond time and space. And likewise, Kant does say that metaphysics is possible as long as we are talking about applied metaphysics, like what he calls rational physics. So a metaphysics that is metaphysical in the sense of being a science not based on experience but based on reason alone, being a science that seeks answers to questions a priori, but being applied metaphysics in the sense that it seeks answers to questions a priori about things which we can experience. It doesn't examine these things in experience. That would not be rational physics, but empirical physics. but still it talks, it examines through reason about things which we can experience, material bodies. That is possible. We can make synthetic judgments a priori about, well, matter, because we can say a priori how matter must be, what basic attributes matter must have in order to even be able to appear to us, in order to be possibly experienced by us. But what Kant shows, and that is exactly what his dialectic is about, what Kant shows is that pure metaphysics, so which is not just metaphysical as in being a science based on reason and not on experience, but rather which also deals only with metaphysical objects, with objects that are not given to us by experience, but only by our reason coming up with these ideas, like God. Kant shows that such a metaphysics is not possible to us. Here, reason would be, as he says, transcendent, which is not the same as transcendental. Yes, transcendent and transcendental both means going beyond experience, but transcendental judgments only go beyond experience to talk about experience, to talk about the once again, the conditions of the possibility of experience, the preconditions of our experience. Transcendent, however, is our reason when it completely transcends, when it completely swings over experience into the realm of the supersensual and tries talking about objects which could never be objects of a possible experience. And such synthetic judgments a priori, because they are not synthesizing concepts in time and space, and therefore they are not making statements about things which could appear in time and space. God, for example, can't appear in time and space. They are empty. And we don't know if there's any truth to what they are saying or not. That is basically the result of Kant's whole critique of pure reason. And dialectic, as I said in the lecture explaining that, dialectic to Kant means the teaching or the doctrine or the science of illusion. He talks about the dialectic of reason because here in metaphysics, here when it comes to its ideas of immortality, of freedom, of God, reason creates certain illusions by its very nature, which it itself falls for, and therefore which we may fall for. And dialectic, as the doctrine of illusion to Kant, is the part of science which has the task to end these illusions. That is exactly what he tried to do in the dialectical part of the critique of pure reason. Critically examining the arguments that reason comes up with, the arguments that metaphysicians before him had come up with, and finding, according to his critical method, which I talked about in its own lecture, finding what is the source from which an illusion springs, and thereby ending that illusion, and thereby closing off that source so that no new errors can spring from it. And that means that the result of the critique of reason, and more specifically of the dialectic, is mainly a negative one. It doesn't give us new insights, it doesn't expand our knowledge, it teaches us something that we didn't know before, but rather it sort of limits our knowledge by showing us the borders, the bounds of our knowledge, which we can't overstep, or at least which we shouldn't try to overstep, because nothing good, nothing true, nothing truly proven will come of it. And that may be a disappointment in a way. To be sure, humans, the unaufklärt humans, because Aufklärung starts precisely when you begin being self-critical, when you begin self-reflecting. The unaufklärt humans, they don't like to do that. They don't want to be self-critical. They also don't want to be criticized by others. They don't want to be shown their self-deception, their lies they tell themselves, and they don't want these lies to be lifted from them. They would probably prefer thinking that they can prove the immortality of their soul, that they can prove their free will, that they can prove God. But Kant is showing, no, you can't. And that's important. He's not just showing, your proof that you attempted so far is not a good one, it doesn't work. Because that would still leave room for other attempts, for trying to do it again and to come up with a better proof. That would just be what skepticism does. But criticism goes deeper. Criticism shows, no, you absolutely can't try a new attempt. Or, I mean, you always can, but it would be irrational to do so, and we know a priori that your new attempt will fail too, because it can be shown that these questions can't be answered at all. But the fact that the result of the critique is a negative one, not a positive one, that it tells us not about new knowledge, but about what we can't know, is not a bad thing, and is not something we should reject, Kant says. To do so, he says at some point, would be like calling the police a bad thing, because the police doesn't serve a positive function. It doesn't positively make your life better. Rather, it serves a negative function in preventing crime, in preventing injustice. Sure, the police doesn't give you new property, it doesn't make you richer, but it makes sure that the property you do have is not stolen from you. It makes sure that you are not becoming poorer that way. And so, that is basically what Kant wants to do with his critical project. He wants to, in a way, police our very reason. Or rather, he wants reason to police itself, because what Kant writes about, of course, are not just his random opinions, but it is reason itself speaking through Kant and criticizing itself. And of course, Kant also doesn't want the state to enforce the results of the critique of pure reason and to restrict free speech in that manner, but rather he would like for people, for metaphysicians, for his colleagues, to read the critique, to understand the critique of pure reason, to think it through, and to then police themselves, to really understand that they can't do a positive metaphysics, and therefore stop trying to do it. And to Kant, this does not mean that metaphysics, or even just pure metaphysics, because once again, applied metaphysics, like rational physics, that's another matter, and I will talk about that in future lectures, about what Kant has to say about that. But even pure metaphysics He's not saying that it should be scrapped completely, that it should not be done anymore. It should keep being done, but it should be done in a different way. It should not be done with the expectation that it can be what Kant calls a doctrine, a positive science expanding our knowledge, but rather it should be done as a discipline, as a negative science, correcting and preventing errors. Because that, Kant says, is what metaphysics can do, and what he did in his dialectic. It can prevent certain metaphysical errors, precisely by showing when someone, thinks and reasons about a metaphysical question and claims to have found a new truth, claims to have come up with a new proof, by precisely showing that this is not possible, that his transcendent reasoning is completely empty. And this goes always, not just one way. So, yes, Kant does show that you cannot prove the immortality of the soul. You cannot prove free will. You cannot prove God. But he also shows that you cannot prove the opposite. And that is important to him. He says that the critique completely defeats materialism, fatalism, and naturalism. So that's what he would call the positions that there is. So materialism says that there's only matter, there is no spirit, therefore there is no spiritual immortal soul. Fatalism, coming from fate, would claim that there is no free will, everything is fated, everything that we do is predetermined. And naturalism would claim that there's no God, there's only nature. It is quite important to Kant that all three of these positions are forever defeated by the critique of pure reason. They are not defeated by him proving the opposite, by him proving that there is a spiritual soul, that there is free will, that there is a God, but rather they are defeated by him proving that they can't prove their claims. Just like the opposing claims cannot be proven, but rather we can't have knowledge one way or the other in this matter. And that, once again, this disciplining, this negative task of always criticizing and limiting our knowledge and our attempts at knowledge, that is what is left for pure metaphysics. And therefore, as Kant likes to say, it cannot be the fundament of religion. Like it cannot prove God or the immortality of the soul, but it can at least still be the defense of religion by showing that the attacks on it are as unfounded as the attempted proofs of it. And that is exactly what this one famous quote of Kant means, that he's saying, I first had to get rid of knowledge to get room for belief. Because as long as you think you can have knowledge about, for example, God, one way or the other, as long as you think you can either prove or disprove God, then there is no place for belief. Why would you believe if you can know? But now, with the knowledge out of the way, with Kant having shown that knowledge is impossible, there is a place for belief. And just to be clear here, by belief, Kant doesn't mean what nowadays most people will think when hearing the word belief. He's not saying that, you can just, you as a private individual, you with your subjectivity, you can now just believe in whatever you like. Sure, you cannot prove God, but you can believe in him. Just like you can believe in Santa Claus or in the Tooth Fairy if you so choose. No. Such a belief would still need a fundament, Kant says, if it is to be reasonable belief. Sure, you can believe in God for irrational reasons, but that is not what Kant supports. No, you would still need a rational reason to believe, which of course wouldn't be a proof for God, but would still be a very good reason to, without a proof, believe in him. And such a reason, Kant believes, is supplied by morality. I will get into Kant's moral philosophy eventually and his philosophy of religion, and then I will explain that further. But the point is, if you are given a rational reason to believe from elsewhere, that is, from morality, you now can believe. You are now allowed to believe, and no one can really attack or shake or disprove your belief. And if someone tries, then metaphysics can shield you from that, or you yourself, by doing metaphysics, can shield you from that. If there was still the belief that knowledge about, for example, God was possible, then the belief in God, the faith, would always be unsure, because there could always remain the possibility that eventually someone will disprove it. Someone will find true knowledge that God doesn't exist. But since Kant has put the knowledge away, he has created a space for belief. He has now created a space where, given a rational reason, you may believe in God, and metaphysics can not itself ground that belief, but can at least defend that belief from attacks by showing that all attacks on it, all attempted disproofs are erroneous. They are as wrong as all attempted proofs are wrong. And also, the whole big chapter on the dialectic is also important because it provides another sort of proof for Kant's transcendental idealism. Kant compares what he's doing with a chemical experiment. And he says the chemist can first do an analysis and see what a substance is made of and separate a substance into its parts. And then after, the chemist can do a synthesis, combining these parts and thereby arriving at the original substance again. And that, if that works, proves that the previous analysis was correct, right? If you can take these parts and arrive at the whole again by recombining these parts, then you have shown that they were indeed the parts, that you were right in dividing the whole into these parts. And well, that is exactly what Kant is doing. He makes the divide between phenomena and noumena, between things that appear to us and the things as they are in themselves, between the sensibilia and the intelligibilia. And in the dialectic, he shows that this divide is correct and necessary, because it is the only way to solve the dialectic, right? The antinomies in rational cosmology show it best. But it is also true for the paralogisms of rational psychology and for the ideal of rational theology. They all So these illusions that reason creates for itself, they all can only be solved by transcendental idealism. And no other philosophical, no other metaphysical position is able to solve these questions. The whole dialectic, the whole conflict of reason with itself only arises if you take the concept of the soul, of the world, of the real, and if you don't distinguish between taking these concepts as appearances or as things in themselves, because as I appear to myself in my consciousness, and as I think of myself as the subject of all thinking, or the world as it appears to me, only ever in parts, or the world as a whole as I think of it, and likewise the real as it appears to me, and the most real being that I necessarily, even if unconsciously, think of, they are not the same. And I need to not confuse them if I don't want to end up with dialectical errors. And here in the dialectic is exactly the point where the critique is born, and where it was born for Kant. Our reason, both at the same time, desires the absolute, is dissatisfied with the relative, but also finds that it can't reach the absolute. And this conflict, this contradiction, is what can lead reason to eventually stop and question itself, to turn away from the objects toward itself, the subject. Since it asks for the objective limits of things, again, the absolute, the unconditional, that which is the limit because everything stems from it, but it itself does not stem from something else. It used to ask about the objective limits, but since it can't answer its own questions here, it turns towards itself and starts asking about its own subjective limits. No longer doing dogmatic philosophy, trying to find out what are the limits of the things, where does the world end, where does the chain of being end, where's the first being, where does thinking end, where's the thinking subject, which is not an attribute of something else, but just the subject of all the stuff happening in the consciousness. Reason is no longer asking for these absolutes, for these objective limits, but rather it is asking, where does my subjective limit lie? Or where is the end of my understanding? That is exactly the question of the critique of pure reason that Kant here has answered. He has answered it by showing that the categories of our intellect are the conditions of the possibility of all our experience, but as such, they can also only be applied to experience, or to at least possible experience, and we cannot use them to go beyond experience. But with that being the result of the whole critique of pure reason, you could still ask, but is that everything there is to reason? So reason is dialectical. Reason creates illusions for itself, and the ideas of reason. And I explained in my lecture on reason how reason is the faculty of ideas. The ideas of reason, they are empty concepts for us. They are things whose reality we can't prove. Is that really everything? is our most noble and most high faculty? In the end, nothing. No, that's not what Kant is saying. But here he makes a turn towards the practical. To him, reason mainly has a function and reality in practical philosophy. And when it comes to the ideas of reason, he says that they are important. He even goes so far as to say that that is what is divine about us, about our soul, that we are able of having and expressing ideas and not just mere concepts of the intellect. But it is important to understand what function these ideas serve or should serve. They are not, as concepts of reason and not of the intellect, they are not concepts that teach us about the reality of things and through which we can learn about the reality of things. If we try to take them as such, they become chimeras and our reasoning becomes dialectical. But rather, they are concepts that sort of guide our thinking and our actions, or should guide them. They point us towards a certain direction. That is the function that reason should serve for us. This is also basically Kant's criticism of Plato's teaching of the ideas. He was right, Kant says, in one way, and again, that is Kant staying true to his sympathetic method and assuming that there's never complete error, but always at least partial truth. Plato was right in with his doctrine of the ideas, pointing out to us that we mustn't seek the absolute in experience, that the sensual world is not complete for us and we can't find a completion in that sensual world itself. That was what was right about Plato. But Plato's doctrine of the ideas to Kant becomes enthusiastic and dreamlike when Plato teaches that we can indeed go beyond the essential world and find the absolute beyond the essential world, and that these ideas teach us or let us understand the nature of things. The ideas serve two important functions to Kant. For one, they let us judge. They serve as a sort of measurement. Reason, as I previously explained, reason always desires totality, desires the absolute. And sure, such a totality cannot be found in experience, but it still can be helpful in understanding experience. It still can be helpful in measuring experience by it. That is what natural scientists do. Like, for example, the chemist may talk about what is water. What attributes does water have? He may say that water has a pH of 0. Now, actually, if you go by experience, you might be hard-pressed in finding pure water in the world. If you look into the ocean or into some pond, you will usually find water being mixed with other substances. And that will distort some of its attributes. That will, for example, mean that the pH probably isn't exactly 0, but slightly above it or slightly below it. But still, it can be quite useful for chemistry to abstract from all these other substances that water might be mixed with and to ask, even if we don't find pure water in experience, what is pure water? What are the attributes of water as such? Or likewise, the physicist may talk about a ball rolling down a slope. That too is something that, in that purity, you probably won't find in nature. You probably won't find a perfect ball. Any actual ball you have will probably be uneven slightly at some point. It will probably have slight bumps, even if they are so small that you can't feel them under the touch or that you can't see them with your eyes. There still might be slight bumps in the ball or in the slope that it is rolling down on. And of course, there's also not just the ball and the slope in reality. And there's the air which the ball needs to pass and needs to push aside, and which is gonna slow the ball down a little bit. But again, it is useful for the physician to abstract from these things and to ask, how would a perfectly round ball on a perfectly even slope without any air or any other factors, how would it behave? How fast would it roll down? So these ideas of reason, this idea of totality, of the absolute, of something pure and complete, can be helpful for us to understand things. They just become dangerous and chimerical if we take them to describe a reality. Like, for example, when you talk about, as the Nazis did, about the white or Germanic or Nordic or Aryan race, or the Jewish or Semitic race. Because, of course, there is no such thing. Just like there is no perfect ball. But anyways, those are theoretical and scientific examples. But to Kant, the ideas of reason serve the function of being a measurement by which we measure reality, mostly when it comes to the practical, when it comes to morality. So, for example, let's take the idea of justice. You won't find perfect justice anywhere in the world. You won't find, whether it's currently or at some point in history, you won't find the perfectly just state, the rational republic that philosophers have talked about and have talked about. You won't find that anywhere. But you shouldn't therefore say that justice as an idea is just a chimera and has no reality and it's useless to think about it, because if you make the judgment that no state is perfectly just, how can you make that judgment? How can you know that no state is perfectly just? Clearly, you can only know that through the idea of perfect justice. This idea is the condition of the possibility of talking about injustice. I always need a measurement that I apply to something in order to say that it falls short. Like, only if I have a measurement that is 2 meters long, can I measure myself and can find that I'm not 2 meters, that I'm below 2 meters. And likewise, only if I have the idea of justice, can I hold it against an actual state and find that it falls short of that idea, that it is to a larger or to a smaller degree unjust. And if someone doesn't have that idea, then they can't criticize. Like, take animals who don't have reason and who therefore don't have ideas. Of course, when they are mistreated, they might feel pain and won't enjoy it. And if given the chance, maybe they will, in the moment, try to fight back, to bite you or kick you, or they will try to run in a moment. But they have no idea of having rights that are broken by that mistreatment. They have no idea of justice, and therefore they don't understand that what is happening to them is unjust. And that's also exactly the reason why, indeed, it isn't unjust. You can't be unjust to something which doesn't understand justice. That is not to say, by the way, that we can just do to animals whatever we want. I will talk about this when I get to Kant's moral philosophy, to what he says about how to treat animals. But still, the thing is, if you look at the way animals are kept in great masses, how they are locked away, never seeing sunlight a day, being slaughtered in mass. If that was done to human, it would be a terrible crime, of course. It would be a great injustice. And humans in that situation could understand that what is happening to them is unjust. But animals can't, and that is exactly why animals will never really try to improve their position. That's exactly why animals will never start a revolution, because for that you would need to have an idea of a better state, even if you never actually experienced that better state yet. Like Martin Luther King, his famous dream speech. You could basically translate dream with idea here. He was talking about a dream which he had never found realized. He hadn't experienced it in the world, but he could think of it. He could, in his language, dream it. And thereby he could measure the reality that he did experience and realize, well, this is not as it should be. This is not just. I want something more. I want something better. And even if Kant says, I ever found something perfect in the world, I ever met a sort of totality, then I couldn't tell from experience. Because experience as such can never give me the concept of a maximum, of something complete, of something which can't possibly be increased anymore. So I could only realize something being perfect by, once again, measuring it by my idea and realizing that it does not fall short of that idea, but actually meets that idea. So imagine, for example, a perfectly good human being, a perfectly holy person, like many believe Jesus was. How, if you met such a person, how would you know that he is perfectly good and holy? You could not know this by him telling you. Because, I mean, the most evil person in the world could claim to be perfectly good and holy. I mean, if that's all you're going by, then you really have nothing to go by. But rather, you would need to look inside yourself, to look at your idea of what a holy person is, and compare that with the person that's actually standing in front of you. Compare that with what that person says, how that person behaves, and find that the person matches the idea. Right? If you meet someone who tells you, I'm very tall, I'm 2 meters, and maybe he's short, maybe he's only, I don't know, 1 meter 50, you can't just believe him because he said so and say, oh, I guess he looks short to me, but he said he's 2 meters, so this is 2 meters now. But rather, you will have to measure him, and you will have to see if indeed he reaches what you, even before meeting him, thought 2 meters are. You can't learn what 2 meters are by him telling you that he's 2 meters, and then by you measuring him and then saying, oh, however tall he is, that's 2 meters because he said so. That's actually quite important when it comes to religion, and I will address this more when I get to Kant's philosophy of religion. But there are people, especially fundamentalists, who will basically tell you that without God and without revelation, without the Bible or without the Quran, we could not know what good or evil is. But if that were the case, we could not know at all. We can't learn what good and evil is by someone telling us. Because how would we know that what he tells us is indeed good and evil? Like, let's say there are two people claiming to be prophets, and they are both saying, I was sent by God, and God is good and holy, and what I say, therefore, is also good and holy. And then one of them told you God's message for you is love thy neighbor, and the other told you God's message for you is kill all the infidels and sacrifice your own child on an altar to God. How would you know which of them is really good or evil? You couldn't know from what they tell you, because both are saying my words are good and holy. Rather, you know beforehand what is good and holy. You know exactly that loving your neighbor is good and that killing people is evil. And that's exactly why you can say that the first of them is giving you a good message and the other is giving you an evil message. And that, by the way, is actually what Jesus also says in the Bible, right? He says that if you want to do the will of he who has sent him, that is of God, then and only then, so if you want to do good, you will find that he, Jesus, is not talking of himself, but is indeed saying something divine, is indeed giving you a divine message. So even here, you need to have these ideas of what is divine, what is holy, what is good. You need to already have them inside of yourself. Maybe only vaguely, maybe only unconsciously. And maybe this holy figure or this prophet, by being an exemplar in which this idea is realized, helps you becoming conscious of this idea of yours. Maybe he brings you clarity, because before you never thought about that idea, and only now that he tells you love thy neighbor, do you start reflecting on what is good, holding these words against your own previously unconscious idea of what is good and finding them to match. But still, you need to have had that idea before, or else you could not make a judgment at all. The amazing thing about us, again, as Kant says, the divine thing about our soul, is that, as he says, even if you lived in a world of devils, even if you grew up in that world of devils and from experience knew nothing but evil, you could still potentially, that's not saying everyone would growing up in that situation, but you could still think of virtue. You could still come up with the idea of goodness and holiness and how the world ought to be, even when the world you know isn't. And that leads me to the second role of the ideas, because the ideas to Kant don't just serve as measurements to measure the world that is by, but rather they also have the function of bringing forth a new world. The concepts of the intellect are archetypes, as Kant says, but the concepts of reason, that is, the ideas, they are archetypes. That means the archetypes, the concepts of the intellect, they are just representations of what is there, especially the empirical ones, like dog, for example. They, as Kant says, don't make things possible. They only make understanding things possible. So a dog is possible without our concept of the dog, or the ocean, or a tree is possible without our concept of the tree. It could exist before humans knew what it is. And that concept doesn't bring it into existence. That concept only lets us understand what it is. It's sort of a thought that is a copy, that is mirroring reality, and thereby allowing us to understand reality, but it is not creating reality. But not so the ideas. They are archetypes. So they, as Kant says, are concepts that don't just make understanding something that is already there possible, but rather they are concepts that make the very thing of which they are a concept possible. Only if you have the idea of justice or the idea of goodness, which is not a thing that already exists in the world and that you just understand by your concept, but which is a thing that is completely in your head for now. But if you have that idea, you can now say, I want to realize this idea of mine. I want to make this world more just. I want to bring this thing of which I'm thinking here, this justice, into existence. Once again, think of Martin Luther King. He hadn't experienced his dream yet. He hadn't experienced a world of equality, where his children were judged not by their skin color, but rather by the content of their character. But he had this idea, and that is exactly what led him to fight for a world in which this idea becomes real. And here I want to stress that what I said about the dialectic and about these three ideas that metaphysics deals with, of the immortality of the soul, of freedom, of God, what I said about them so far, that is that their reality cannot be proven, that is only true, Kant says, for speculative, for theoretical philosophy. Here I cannot prove whether my idea of God is an idea that has reality or whether it's just a chimera. But that does not mean that they can't have a practical reality. That is a completely different question. That is not at all affected by this. And by practical reality, I will talk more about this when I get to Kant's Practical to a Moral Philosophy. But by that practical reality, what Kant means is that no matter whether God and the immortality of the soul and freedom can be proven or not, that doesn't prevent you from acting as if they were real. You can act as if there was a holy God that wanted you to do good and that would eventually judge you, whether you know that there is such a God or not. And that is the function that the ideas serve for Kant. And this function, the ideas being archetypes, leading you to not just understand the world as it is, but to change the world, to try and bring forth something new. This means that you can only bring something new when you have ideas. Otherwise, you can just copy what is already there. And having ideas, or being able to bring forth ideas, that is what genius means to Kant, which is exactly why he says that philosophy is, and philosophy can be taken in the broadest sense here, so including applied philosophy, including natural science. Philosophy is a science that needs some sort of genius. I will talk more about what genius is to Kant in a few weeks. But I do want to stress that this role of the ideas, being archetypes, bringing forth something, leading us in our actions, giving us a direction, this is a function they serve primarily in the practical and moral philosophy, but they also serve in the theoretical, in our inquiry into nature. So, for example, Kant says that this idea of God, so of a first cause of everything, um, it cannot be proven, sure. And even if it was proven, it would not really extend our knowledge of nature, because God is beyond nature. And I mean, since we can't know God's inner nature, we don't know what his will is. So just by saying God caused the world, we don't learn anything new about the world, because we don't learn why did God cause this world and not another? What made him choose this world the way it is? Science is about understanding laws, being able to make predictions. But having this idea of God doesn't let me predict what world would need to be created and what world couldn't be created. So really, in that way, even if we could prove God, it would be useless for natural science. But still, Kant says the natural scientist, even if he is an atheist, will probably be guided by that idea in some way, because he will probably treat the world as if it has one cause. Now, whether that cause is God or not doesn't really matter here, but still, he will assume that the world doesn't come from multiple sources, but it comes out of one source, like the Big Bang. Why does the natural scientist assume that a priori? I mean, he doesn't assume that because experience taught him so. He assumes so because he has an idea in his mind of a first cause. And that idea guides him in the way he examines nature. And in that way, the ideas of God, of the soul, of freedom do serve their function, even in theoretical philosophy, even in understanding nature. They do have a certain necessity, but their necessity is not that of, it's not an objective necessity, it's a subjective necessity of the method. Because the intellect, as I previously said already in previous lectures, the intellect brings synthetic unity into our perceptions and makes them experience. It brings synthetic unity into sensuality. Well, reason, as a sort of higher intellect, brings synthetic unity into the intellect, into our thoughts. It tries to unite our thoughts. And sure, we mustn't assume that the unity is already there, or that it has been found, that we reach something absolute. But we must strive, forever strive towards that point of the absolute, that point of total systematic unity of all our thoughts, of all our experience. And in that way, reason guides even the natural scientist. Reason has, as Kant says, a regulative function for us. Specifically, there are three regulative laws of reason that Kant talks about at this point. And these laws are the law of homogenity, the law of specification, and the law of continuity. And I want to explain all of those and give examples for those. So, the law of homogeneity says that, well, as I previously said, reason always wants unity. The reason always desires totality. And this law of homogeneity springs from that desire. And reason basically tells us that whenever there's a manifold, whenever there are various things, we can sort of unite them into one. We can find a higher concept under which they fall. This is, first of all, Kant says, a logical principle. Like if you have two different concepts, let's say the concept of a cat and a dog, then you have this logical principle of homogeneity that tells you that while they are different, they are also homogeneous. They are also the same in some way. I can unite them both under the umbrella concept of a mammal. And again, if I have other concepts of birds and fish and insect alongside those cats and dogs who are mammals, then I can again unite them and say they are all animals. So yes, they are different species, but their genus, so the top category to which they are subcategories, is still similar. And again, if I now compare animals with trees and flowers and so on, I can say they are all living beings. And if I compare these living beings with stones or metals or whatever, I can say they are material beings. They all are made up of matter. So I can always go higher till I reach the highest point, and at the highest point I won't have a multitude of concepts, but I will have one general concept, which according to Kant would then be the concept of something. So everything is a something or a nothing. So that is a logical principle, which, by the way, is not one that Kant claims to have come up with, but rather which was known even in antiquity. And then, second, you have the principle of specification, which is sort of the opposite to this principle of homogeneity, because while the first one says that two different species can be united under the same genus, here we are claiming that the individuals that are under one genus can always be divided into several species. And when you have done that, you can again divide each species further. So I can divide animals into different classes of animals, or I can divide mammals into different species of mammals. And again, even if I have one species like dog, I can further divide it. I can say there are German shepherds, and there are golden retrievers, and there are terriers, and so on. So I can always make further divisions. And there is no stopping point. Like, there's not a lowest species which I can't further divide. Of course, in life, we often stop at some point, because often there's just no reason to make further specifications. But this logical principle says that it is always a possibility. Stopping at some point is really arbitrary. Like, I can take this race of dogs. I can say, okay, here there are the terriers, for example. But I could further divide them into, let's say, black terriers and gray terriers and brown terriers. There's nothing stopping me from doing that. And then I can further divide the black terriers. I can say there are black terriers that are over 2 years old and ones that are under 2 years old. Or I can say there are the terriers that live in Europe and that live outside of Europe. I can come up with all sorts of specifications, down to the smallest specifications. I can say there are terriers that live in my block or that live in the next block, and there's nothing stopping me from doing so. It is always when I put several things, several individuals into the same group, they may have some similarities, but being several individuals, they surely also have something which is different about them. And so it is really arbitrary whether I want to group them together or whether I want to further divide that group. And lastly, you have the law of continuity, which is basically the middle between the other two laws, which basically says that there are no gaps, no jumps. So if you have two species, there can be a middle species, once again, between them, filling the gap between them. Like, for example, sure, you can say here there are the mammals, and mammals birth living young. And here there are other sorts of animals, like the birds and the reptiles and the fish and so on, who lay eggs. But there is not just a gaping abyss between them, but there need to be some sort of middle forms, our reason tells us. And indeed, we find something like the platypus, which is a mammal which still doesn't birth living young but lays eggs. So these are three principles our reason follows. Now, why exactly these three principles? Kant doesn't really say, but whenever there is such a number, like 3 or 4 in Kant, you should assume, even if he doesn't outright say so, that it can be explained through the table of categories, because I mean that's what the table of categories is about. It is the framework for Kant's whole architectonic, and the architectonic, as I explained in its own lecture, is very important as a method for Kant. Kant always wants to make sure that he doesn't just, well, that he isn't just doing rhapsody, just coming up with whatever happens to be on his mind, because then you would never be sure if what he's saying is complete or if there can be more. But rather, he wants to be architectonic in deducing what he says from the table of categories, since they are the basic concepts according to which all our thinking happens. And here I would say that you can probably explain these three principles quite well from the three categories of quantity, or from the three judgments of quantity. That is, the principle of homogeneity comes from the concept of unity. So everything is one or can be brought under one umbrella. The principle of specification fits with multiplicity or plurality. So saying there's not just one, there are multiple species. And then Kant himself says that the principle of continuity, comes from a combination of the first two principles, and the same, as I explained in my lecture on the table of categories as the key to Kant's system, the same can be said of the categories. Here too, under each of the 4 titles, the third category comes out of the first 2 being united in a way. So just like totality, allness is a multiplicity that is at the same time a unity. Just like that, this law of continuity comes from saying that everything is homogeneous and saying that there's infinite specification that is possible, and combining those two and saying that it is this homogeneity, it is this unity which is being specified. So there must be a continuity between the various species. The point to Kant is that these are 3 logical principles of our reason, but they are more than that. They are transcendental principles. They guide our experience. They guide how we look at the world, whether it's consciously or not. So let's start with the first principle. We have this unconscious desire for unity. And whenever we are faced with a multiplicity in the world, we assume that it can somehow be reduced to a certain unity. So when we find various individuals of one species, like various human beings, we don't assume that 8 billion humans, that they all come from completely separate families or races or whatever, but rather we assume that they have common ancestors. And whether you believe that all of them came from Adam and Eve, or that they have been that they have come into being through evolution, as different as those two explanations are, they both have in common that they follow this principle of homogenity, that they say humans must have common ancestors. And the same is true for the world as a whole, right? You probably, whatever else you might believe, you probably assume that this universe doesn't have several causes or several sources. Whether you believe it came from the Big Bang, whether you believe it was created in 7 days by some god, you still believe that you can reduce this multiplicity to one unity in the end. And I mean, even if you go to mythologies that are polytheistic, that have many gods, they too usually won't claim that these many gods were just there in their multitude from the beginning, but rather in those mythologies too, there's usually one common cause. Like maybe there was a first god who created the others, or maybe they sprang from the original chaos or whatever. That depends on the mythology, but still, you rarely have a mythology just starting with two gods that are equally original, but rather everything starts from one. And this is something, again, that guides us in the way we look at nature. This principle guides scientists, for example. So in physics, you have several natural laws. But physicists, for the longest time, assumed that these various laws can be reduced to a smaller number of laws. So different phenomena in the world can, as much as they may seem to be different, can be explained through the same basic law. And over time, we narrowed things down more and more. So, for example, we found that something as simple as an apple falling down from a tree, and something seemingly completely different, like the moon moving over the sky, can be explained through the same law of gravity, can be explained through the same pull the Earth has on the apple and on the moon. And we have reached a point in the last century in physics where everything in nature could be reduced to 4 basic natural laws, or 4 basic forces of nature. But still, natural scientists, physicists, were not, and are not even to this day, content with that. And no human being would be. This is because of the nature of our reason. It's almost like an instinct. Even if we can't give the reason why. If someone tells us there are 4 basic forces in the world, that's not satisfying. We almost automatically ask the question, maybe 2 or 3 or all 4 of them can be reduced to one common, more basic, more fundamental force. And we try to find that. And here we can see that this is a transcendental principle. That is, it is a principle that is not empirical. It's not something we learned from experience. How could we? I mean, as long as we haven't found a unity, as long as we haven't found a homogeneity, we don't know that it is there, right? So we don't know this a posteriori. Why would physicists try to reduce those 4 basic forces to 3 or 2 or even 1? As long as they haven't reduced them to that, they don't know that it is possible, right? So this is clearly a transcendental principle. It's one that we have a priori. It's one that is not taken out of experience, but rather that comes before experience and that guides the way we make experience. But, Kant says, the difference to the categories that come from intellect and to the principles of the intellect, which spring from these categories and which I discussed in the lecture on the principles and on the schematism, the difference is that these transcendental principles of reason, they are transcendental principles, but they are not constitutive principles, they are regulative principles. Meaning, they are not conditions of the possibility of experience. They are only, so to say, conditions of the possibility of us making sense of our experience and completing our experience. And that means that we don't know that they are true. We don't know whether there really is only one basic force, only one basic law of nature, or there are several. We don't know if the world has one source or if it has several. It's just that we instinctively want to reach that unity, that oneness. So the difference is the intellect, Kant says, is constitutive for experience. With its concepts, with its principles. That means they really allow us to make predictions about experience. Our predictions must be true because experience cannot ever possibly contradict the principles of the intellect, Kant says. Because, again, they are conditions of the possibility of experience. If something contradicted them, it could not possibly be part of our experience. So we can say, and we can be sure of that, Kant says, a priori, that, for example, all matter in the world must somehow remain, because all substances must remain. They can change their accidents. So matter can be transformed and transferred and change its attributes, but it cannot be completely and utterly destroyed, just like new matter cannot be created out of nothing. Or we can say a priori that everything that happens, everything that we perceive happening, must have a cause. And we can always seek that cause, even if it isn't immediately obvious what caused it. Those are principles of the intellect. Those are principles that we know must be true because otherwise we couldn't make experience. Something contradicting those principles could never be experienced. Now, that means they are constitutive principles. These 3 principles of reason, on the other hand, they are regulative principles because experience could be possible without them. Like, it is possible to experience the world whether the world has one source or several sources. But even though they don't constitute our very experience, they regulate how we deal with experience, how we make experience, and how we seek to make experience. Like, for example, take such a principle as that which is known as Occam's razor. Occam's razor basically says that you must not, unless you have good cause to do so, you must not multiply the principles. Meaning, when you have a phenomenon that you want to explain, that you want to find a cause or a reason for, try to explain it through the principles, through the laws you already have and already know, and don't assume there's a new one unless you have reason to do so. Like, and we follow Occam's razor usually in life. Even if unconsciously, even if we have never heard the name Occam's razor, we usually will follow it. Like, if you walk down a beach and you see footprints that look like human footprints, you will probably, without thinking much, assume that there was another human who walked here before you. Now, this is not proven until you've actually seen it. It could be possible, potentially, that somewhere back at the other end of the beach, a spaceship landed, and an alien who is somewhat humanoid and has a somewhat human-like body and therefore similar footprints, an alien walked down that beach. There's nothing telling you, when you are just looking at the footprints, that this is not the case. But as long as you don't have a good reason to assume that there was an alien walking here, like if maybe you saw the spaceship standing there at the end of the beach, there simply is no rational reason to assume that there's an alien when you don't know whether aliens exist and whether aliens, even if they do exist, visit Earth, rather than assuming as an explanation that it was just another human being, because you know that other human beings do exist and do leave such footprints. So you can see that Occam's razor is a regulative principle. Again, you have no proof a priori that it wasn't an alien, but still you are going to automatically assume that it wasn't an alien. You're probably not even going to think of the possibility of it even being an alien. So Occam's razor regulates the way you deal with your experience, and it regulates the way you try to make sense of your experience and you try to find reasons for your experience. Like, right? Likewise, when you know that you put milk into your fridge and now you open your fridge and the milk is gone, you could assume that maybe some magic happened. Maybe someone made a spell that made your milk disappear. But you are maybe, if let's say you have a roommate, maybe the first thing you will assume is that your roommate took the milk and maybe drank it or whatever. Because again, Occam's razor tells you to not multiply the principles without reason. You know that you have a roommate, you know that your roommate is capable of taking out milk out of the fridge. You don't know that there's magic. So unless you have a really good reason, because something really can't be explained through the principles you already have, to come up with a new principle as a principle of explanation, you usually won't do it. And this principle of Occam's razor, which guides you in everyday life, but which also guides natural scientists, this principle is clearly an application of this general principle of homogeneity, right? So basically, Occam's razor assumes that there isn't just a multitude of different possible explanations and different laws of nature and different phenomena, but rather they can all be reduced to the same set of explanations, to the same set of natural laws. And in that way, it serves a regulative function. And the same is true for the other two principles of reason, like the principle of specification. Again, Kant says it is not just a logical principle, but it also, when we go into the world and try to make experience, it serves as a transcendental principle. I can't know a priori that a given species can be divided into various subspecies. How would I know that before I have found the subspecies? But still, we sort of automatically assume that. And again, this guides us in the way we make experience. Natural scientists, again, will follow this principle of specification. Like, they will be confronted with something, with certain individuals, and they will almost instinctively try to find differences. Like, if they find that there's one species of animal which, let's say, lives on two different islands, then they will probably try and find, even though it's the same species and therefore they have lots of similarities, but still the biologist will probably go and try and find what is the difference between the individuals on this island and on that island, because he will assume, even before he has found that they are any different, he will assume that it is possible to further divide this species into these two subspecies, to say that maybe since they have been separated for a while, they develop differently. And indeed, we can always further divide a species. Like, when it comes to animal species, different animals of the same species living in different places, they are different. Like, even if you take very common birds like pigeons or sparrows, that are almost everywhere, just like the humans in different countries or in different parts of the same country, even, they have their differences. Like, there is something like dialects or accents among birds. An ornithologist who studied a certain kind of bird all his life can probably tell you that the birds in this city and the same species of bird in another city, they have a slightly different way of singing their song. So I can further specify, they are the same species of bird, sure, so they have lots in common, but I can further specify them. And I can probably narrow it down even more. Even within that one city, I can say that this family of birds, so the children of this one couple of birds, they share certain similarities amongst themselves, while the children of this other couple of birds, they are different in a slight way, and again, among themselves share certain similarities. And the same, lastly, is true for the law of continuity. Natural scientists are, once again, always going to assume that there is a continuity, even before having found it. Like, if they found a new species of animal, whether a living one or maybe as a fossil, but let's say they find a new species of animal, and it is very, very different from all the animals we know. Let's say it's not an insect, it's not a fish, it's not a bird, it doesn't belong into any of those classes, then they would probably assume that nature didn't just jump here. Like, evolution didn't suddenly make a jump and produce something that was completely different and only very, very distantly related to everything else. But rather, they are going to assume that there was a continuum, that there was a continuous development. And they are probably going to assume that even if now there is a gap in nature, that is probably only because the species who used to fill out that gap died out. And they are probably going to try and find those missing links, to find at least fossils of those missing links. And the same, of course, would be true for a scientist who doesn't study animals, but who studies humans, like a historian, an archaeologist. If he finds ruins of a certain civilization that has a certain level of technology or a certain architecture, which is very different from other civilizations he found in that area, he's probably going to assume that there wasn't suddenly a jump. Like, human beings didn't just 1 year start to build completely different buildings, or suddenly made huge technological advancements and jumped centuries into the future, but rather he's probably going to assume that there was a continuous development, and that he just needs to look further, that maybe he can dig up more ecological findings that haven't been found yet, but that are hopefully somewhere to be found, which would fill in the gap. So again, all of these three principles, they are transcendental principles. They are not empirical. We don't take them out of experience. Rather, we approach experience with these principles. So even before having made an experience, we assume that experience will follow these principles. But again, they are not constitutive principles. So we can't know a priori that indeed experience follows these principles. It could be possible that it doesn't, but still they guide the way we approach experience and try to make experience. And they indeed serve an important function in guiding us that way. As regulative principles, they are important and lead to many new discoveries. If scientists didn't assume that there was continuity, and therefore when there's a gap in nature, there's some link bridging that gap, they would probably never look for that link and probably never find it. If scientists didn't assume that you could always specify something further, their knowledge would probably stay superficial. They would never go deeper and never find certain differences that there are. Like, for example, in medicine, right? In the past, men and women were just assumed to be the same because we are all human, right? And that caused problems for women. It still does, because it's still not, because we are still not completely over that. Like certain new pharmaceuticals that were developed were often only tested on men, and then they didn't have any negative side effects on men, so they were released onto the market, and you could now buy them in the pharmacy and get them prescribed by your physician. But maybe since women's bodies are somewhat different, maybe they do have negative side effects on women, and that wasn't found because the studies were only done with men. Likewise, when it comes to our anatomy, to our bones, like they too are slightly different. And if you need, for example, new hips in your old age, in the past, like my grandma, for example, has this problem. She got basically male hips, which of course don't perfectly fit her body because she doesn't have a male body. So if we just assumed everything to be the same, our knowledge would stay superficial and we wouldn't discover differences that maybe are important. But if scientists follow this principle of specification and say that, sure, we are all human, but maybe men and women still have some differences that could be discovered and that are important in their consequences for medicine, then we would never find such differences. And likewise, without the law of homogeneity, we would just accept that there's a multitude, that there are many different phenomena, many different laws of nature, and we would never discover the underlying unity under them. What is important, however, is to understand that these three principles, that they really are just regulative principles. They don't tell us how reality is, but how we look at reality and how we try to make sense of reality. And I think it would be quite helpful, especially in today's world, to learn that from Kant. Which is why I want to give two examples from current political debates, both from the right and from the left, from the topic of nationalism and racism, and from the topic of gender and sexualities. Because I think both could benefit a lot from people aufklären themselves through Kant. Let's start with something like nationalism. Nationalists will think that a certain nationality, like the Germans or the English or the French or the Italians, as if that was some sort of fact, some objective fact of nature. And of course, if you know a little bit about any such country, about history, about culture, you know it is not. Like, what is a German supposed to be? Like, sure, I can look at Germany as something homogeneous. I can treat it as a unity. I can say there are the Germans living here and they are speaking the German language. But then I can also apply the principle of specification. I can say there are and there have been historically various Germanies. Like Germany, compared to some others, is a relatively young country. It was only united in 1871. And before that, there were various principalities, kingdoms, dukedoms, city-states. And it wasn't necessary for them to unite in that way. Like back then, when that unification happened, Austria didn't unite with the West, even though it also spoke German and was considered German in previous times. That wasn't a historical necessity for Austria and Germany to be separated today. Likewise, for the German-speaking part of Switzerland, they separated from the West even before. In the late Middle Ages, in the Renaissance era, the cities there formed their own sort of federation, which after the 30 Years' War separated from the rest of the empire completely. But that was not a historical necessity. And also those parts that did unite into Germany, not everyone was just the same because they united. Like some were Protestant, some were Catholic, they spoke different dialects. And of course, not everyone was happy with unification. And especially after the lost First World War, there were people, be it in the Rhine region, be it in Bavaria, there were separatists that wanted to get out of the hole again. And it's not without force that the country was united and held together at first. And I mean, even nowadays, separatist movements may currently not be a big thing, but there are some smaller groups in Bavaria or in Saxony who would like to split from the West. And of course, there are still differences. The north is very different from the south of Germany. I feel very much disconnected being here in Berlin from a Bavarian. I don't have much in common with Bavarians. Their whole culture, their manner of speaking, their politics is very much different. And of course, likewise, we had the separation of Eastern and Western Germany, which can still very much be felt to this day. Again, in mindsets of the people, in the ways they live, in the politics of the regions. So, sure, we can say there's one Germany, but we can also say there's a difference between Western and Eastern Germany. And then again, we can further differentiate. I can say that there's a difference between people living here in Berlin and let's say people living in Hamburg. And again, within Berlin, I can say there is a stark difference between my district of Neukölln, which is the district where the most immigrants live, which has lots of Turkish and also Arabic and many, many other nationalities, people, to, let's say, a district like Zehlendorf, which is a bit more on the outside of the city, which has many villas, many mansions, which is sometimes called the district where all the dentists live. So a lot of people who are well off live there, who have their own houses there, and there's surely a higher percentage of Germans there. Sure, they are both part of Berlin, but they are still different. So I can further specify here. And even when it comes to my district of Neukölln, there's a stark difference between the northern part of Neukölln, where the immigrants do live, and the more southern parts of Neukölln. And even here in the northern parts of Neukölln, the three main streets here, they all are different in a way. They all have sort of their different culture. Like there's one main street, the Sonnenallee, where there are many Arabs and many Arab shops, and then in another part you have more Turkish people. So and I can go further down. I can say that this street is and the people living here are somewhat different from the next street and the people living there. So I can always get more specific and I can always find the differences. And that, of course, is true for other countries as well. Like, especially if we look at history. Like nowadays, sure, you look at a map and you just see France, this one country. But if you go back a few centuries, in the Middle Ages, for a long time, the kings, they maybe controlled some parts of the north, like the area around Paris, but they had very little power in the south. And the south of France had sort of its own culture. It was much more Mediterranean, more in a way influenced by the Romans and the Greeks. It had its own sort of language. The Languedoc, it had its own sorts of religious movements in the Middle Ages, like the Cathars, and its own sort of culture, like the medieval troubadour poets. And in some way, you could say that it was in culture and in language maybe more closely connected to the Spanish parts bordering it than to the north of France. And only through various political events, like the crusade against the Albigans, against the Cathars, did the North, the northern culture, the northern language, the French king in the north in Paris gain more influence there and made it part of a larger country, which also, of course, involved some suppression and some force. Or look at Italy. Sure, now it may seem so naturally to treat this as one country, right? It looks like one on the map, and it's bordered by the mountains, by the Alps in the north. Like that seems like almost a natural border. But again, if you consider history, since the end of the Roman Empire till about the middle of the 19th century, Italy had not been unified under one sort of government. In fact, if you look at history after the Roman Empire and also before the Roman Empire, there was always a stark difference between northern Italy and southern Italy. In the south, in antiquity, you had Greek settlers and many Greek cities, many Greek colonies. Then later, after the Western Roman Empire fell, the Byzantine Empire, so the Eastern Roman Empire, still for a time had control over the south of Italy, but not over the north. And then the south for a time was ruled by the Arabs, and the Saracens mixed with the people already living there. And then it was controlled for a time by the Normans. And then the south, so Naples and Sicily, in later times it was under the control of the Spanish crown. And in the middle, of course, you had the papacy separating the south and the north. And then in the north, on the other hand, in older times, you had Etruscans living in the north. Then later, you had Germanic tribes, you had the Langobards moving into the north. Then later in the Middle Ages, in the north, you had various city-states like Florence or Milan, and the north was part of the empire, like of the Holy Roman Empire. It was in that way united with Germany. Now, of course, not very much united. It was still quite separate and quite independent from the rest of the empire. But still, in that way, it was completely different from the south of Italy. And the emperors did try to assert some influence there, or the emperors did pass through there when they went to Rome, each new emperor to be crowned. And then, of course, later in the Renaissance, these cities and these smaller principalities had become pretty much independent from the empire. But now they had their own sort of culture, their own sort of politics. I mean, we talk of the Italian Renaissance, but it is mostly the North Italian Renaissance. It is mostly the Tuscan Renaissance, which then spreads throughout the rest of Italy, just like it spreads to other parts of Europe. But a lot of what we associate with it come from Florence and Venice and so on, and not from the south of Italy. And even when Italy was unified, I mean, even to this day, there's a stark contrast between North and South. The South being much poorer, the North being richer, and even in more recent days, there have been separatist movements in the North, like the Lega Nord party, which since has abandoned these separatist desires, but still, it's a very recent development. The North, and surely there are still people there nowadays who want to split from the South. And the same I could do for Spain, for example, where we still had strong separatist movements in very recent years, or for other countries. My point is that it is really quite arbitrary to say this is one country, this is one unity, one language, one culture, one people. I'm not saying it's completely wrong. Like, surely all Italians do have something in common, and all Germans have something in common if you compare them with one another. But if you don't compare them with one another, if you only look at Germany or Italy in isolation and at its various parts, then you can also go into specification and see lots of differences. And often, what is a country or what is multiple countries is sort of a historic coincidence. Like, you can explain that if you go into the history, but it probably wasn't necessary that way. There are some countries like Germany and Austria, or like various Balkan countries, like Bulgaria and Macedonia, let's say, that speak the same language or almost the same language, and it's not hard to envision a different course of history where they could have possibly been one country. And on the other hand, it's not hard to envision a course of history where what is one country today, like the US, if let's say if the Civil War had gone differently, could have become several countries. And not just the law of homogeneity and specification is in place here, but of course also the law of continuity. Like, there are always places, there are always regions that are sort of both. Because of course there's not, even if it looks like that on the map, in reality there's not just a border, a red line drawn on the ground, and all people on this side of the line have one culture and one language, and all people on that side have another culture and another language. But rather, very often, there's a continuity. Like, when you look at border regions like Alsace-Lorraine, for the longest time, Germany and France fought over that, and it went back and forth between them. And only after the Second World War it went finally to France. But of course, it has, to this day, it has German influences. You can hear the names of cities like Strasbourg, which is a German name. And to this day, people in Alsace-Lorraine probably are, while they are French, they are probably more similar to Germans than, let's say, French people in Marseille. Or likewise, where France borders not Germany but Italy, you have Savoy. Is that Italian? Is that French? Is that its own thing? What about the language there? Where does one language end and another language begin? What is really a language, its own distinct language, and what is a dialect of another language? Like, French and Italian and Spanish, they all come from Latin. And there are no clean-cut borders where people stop, especially if you look into the past. Like, nowadays, the borders are somewhat more clean because over time, after states have come into being, people were more unified, and they learned in school and so on to speak one common language. But if you look at the past, there's not a clear-cut border where you can say here Italian ends and French begins, but rather there's a continuity. There are always middle dialects that are somewhat between French and Italian. Just like you couldn't say in the past, oh, here German ends and Dutch begins, but rather there's a continuity from Dutch into German. In northern Germany, you have dialects that sound more like Dutch than like the average common German. And my point here is that these are things that some people care about very much. These are things that politics are done with, right? What is a country? What is a nation? What isn't? Like, look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Some say Ukraine is not its own country, it's part of Russia. There is no such thing as Ukraine and Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language. The Ukrainian language is just a Russian dialect. And others say, no, Ukraine is very much its own thing. Now, who is right, who is wrong? If we talk about objective facts, I mean, what is a nation objectively? we decide how we look at the world. So here it is important to once again be not a materialist but an idealist. We could very much envision another course of history where Russia and Ukraine had been one country, and where we would consider their language just different versions, different dialects of the same language. But now they are two different countries. And in fact, the Russian attempt to force Ukraine to be one country with them probably only pushed Ukraine further away, and probably helped very much in fostering its own national identity. But we must realize that both, in a way, are just fictions. Both is true and is not true. And this is, of course, important when it comes to things like nationalism or racism. Like nowadays in Europe, refugees coming from the Arab world, or also from Afghanistan or Pakistan or whatever, or from Africa, refugees who often are of Mohammedan faith, they are a big political topic. And in many countries, whether it's here in Germany or in other countries, Nazi parties who spread hate and propaganda against such refugees are on the rise. And in politics in my country, I often hear such things as, we Europeans, we are not like them, they are different from us. And we Europeans, we have our culture, our values, we have our own Judeo-Christian values. So here, homogenity is applied to Europe, and we act as if all of Europe is one. And then on the other hand, we act as if the Mohammedan, the Islamic world, as if all of that is also one. And as if these two regions, or cultural spheres or whatever, as if they are different from one another. And of course you can do that. I'm not saying it's completely wrong. For sure, a German or an Italian or a Frenchman, they have certain things in common with each other that they might not have in common with a Turkish person or an Egyptian person or an Iraqi person. And these among themselves may also have certain things in common that they don't have in common with the German or the Frenchman or whatever. I'm not denying that. But on the other hand, you could also further specify this Europe. You don't have to treat Europe as one unity. And in fact, Europeans themselves, both historically but even now, have not treated themselves as one unity, except when they needed to be racist against others. I mean, let's just take this talk of Judeo-Christian values. I mean, how shameless, how dishonest to pretend that there is a common Judeo-Christian culture, a unity between Jews and Christians, and they are so different from the Mohammedans. If anything, this Judeo-Christian unity has only existed for a few decades. Because, I mean, it's not even a century ago when we didn't really consider Jews to be one and the same with us, fellow Europeans with the same values, but rather when we genocided Jews. So, how shameless, how deeply dishonest to now pretend as if for hundreds or thousands of years the Jews and the non-Jews in Europe had lived happily together as one common culture, and now there come these Arabs who are so completely different. When in fact, for centuries, Arabs also lived side by side with Jews, and they didn't treat them worse than the Europeans treated their Jews. In fact, there have been enough instances where they treated theirs better. And of course, also, apart from this Judeo-Christian bullshit, it's not like there aren't enough differences between Europeans. I mean, what does a Spaniard have in common with a Polish person, or a Swede with someone from Italy? And it's not like Europeans haven't been hating on each other or haven't fought wars with each other. And the same can be said for the Mohammedans. I mean, how much does a Turkish person really have in common with someone from Indonesia? Or even with someone from their neighboring country, from Iraq? Or even with someone from within Turkey who is not Turkish but Kurdish? There are always differences. And on the other hand, sure, I can take Europe, this Judeo-Christian Europe, and on the other hand, the Mohammedan world, and I can treat them as opposites. But nothing would prevent me, if I wanted to, from also applying the principle of homogeneity and treating them as a bigger unity too, as compared to other parts of the world. Because sure, there are differences between Europe and the Arab countries, but then there are differences within them between, let's say, Germany and France, let's say, between Egypt and Syria. But on the other hand, I could also very easily say we are part of one and the same border culture. If I can speak of a Judeo-Christian culture, why can't I speak of a Judeo-Christian Islamic culture? I mean, I could say that we share the same two roots. Those two roots being, on the one hand, Greek culture and philosophy, because not just for the European Middle Ages, but also for the Arab Middle Ages, those were very important, and all their thinking was based on Aristotle and Plato just as much as all our thinking was. And the other root would be Abrahamic religion. Because, of course, Islam is as much Abrahamic as Christianity is. And I could therefore treat all the nations that historically have been influenced by Greek philosophy and by Abrahamic religion as one homogeneous unity and set them apart from, let's say, China. Surely an Arab who also has been historically influenced by the thought of Aristotle, who also follows one God, the God of Abraham and Moses and David and Jesus, surely that Arab has more in common with me than a Chinese person who might be a Buddhist or a Confucianist. And of course, if aliens suddenly invaded us, we would probably find out that all of us, no matter if we have been influenced by the Greeks and by Abrahamic religion, or whether we have been influenced by ancient Chinese or Indians and by Vedic religion, that all of us are human, and as humans form a unity against these invading aliens. So the point is, in all of this, that we mustn't treat these things as simple facts that are set in stone. We mustn't say, oh, this group is a unity, and this group there is different. That is a perspective that we choose to assume. And I'm not saying that it is a completely wrong or completely arbitrary perspective, but I am saying that other perspectives, where this group that we treat as a unity is in fact made up of several groups, or on the other hand, where these two groups that we treat of as being different belong to one and the same larger group, that other such perspectives would be equally correct and equally valid. And an aufklärt person is capable of assuming different perspectives and of having these perspectives and of ruling over these perspectives, as opposed to being their slave and having them rule over him. An aufklärt person will be aware this is a perspective I chose to take, and won't act like this is objective reality and I'm just describing the facts, and everyone who says something else, who has another perspective, just denies reality. But let's turn to the second example I wanted to mention. While the right is obsessed with nation and race and culture, the left is obsessed with gender and sexuality. And of course, the right is also obsessed with it, in that they fight and oppose whatever the left says about it. And you all know the debates about this. You all know how it gets ridiculed by the right when Facebook has, I don't know, 70 genders or whatever it is that you can pick from. And indeed, it is very easy to look up online. There are sites about this. There are whole wikis about this. To look up online all the gender identities or all the sexual identities that people have come up with. Like, let's for simplicity and brevity, let's just stick to sexual identities. Sure, you could say, hey, people, either they are heterosexual and like the opposite gender, or they are homosexual and like their own gender. You could say that. But the thing is, you can further specify this. Not all heterosexual people or not all homosexual people are the same, because probably no one just likes women or just likes a man, but they probably like certain women or certain men. Sure, you can find two guys who are both attracted to women, and therefore you could say they have the same sexuality, they are both heterosexual. But maybe one of those guys likes women with big breasts and one of those guys likes women with small breasts. So you could also say they have different sexualities. And nothing prevents you from coming up with names for that. From saying one of them is big breast sexual and one of them is small breast sexual. And you can always specify further. Like, you will probably find many guys who like big breasts or who like small breasts. But then within such groups, you could, again, create new subgroups. You could say, oh, there are some guys who like big-breasted women who are small, and there are some guys who like tall, big-breasted women. So again, we have different groups. And you can go further and further down. And, I mean, if we are honest, there are probably no two people on Earth who have the exact same sexuality, who find the exact same people equally attractive or equally unattractive. So in a way, sure, you can say there are only two sexualities, there are only hetero or homosexual people. But in another way, it would be equally valid to say you have about 8 billion sexualities, because everyone has his own sexuality. And then, of course, the law of continuity also applies to this. I mean, this should be known for more than a century now. Freud already discovered that babies aren't born as being heterosexual or being gay or whatever, but as he said, they are polymorphously perverse. And the sexuality, certain attractions, as well as maybe certain fantasies, certain kinks, and so on, they develop in the course of your life, often early childhood, but they develop. And there are probably not any set borders. I mean, many people who maybe later in life identify as heterosexual and only go after people of the opposing gender. Maybe in their youth, they had some sort of homosexual experience with a friend. And I mean, this is something that, for example, Kinsey found that um, there's hardly anyone who is really 100% heterosexual or 100% homosexual, but rather sexuality is a spectrum. You can say that some people are more strongly attracted to women or to men and less so to the other, but it's probably not 0 and 100. And so when you look at all the different sexualities that you can find online, I mean, there's really an insane number of them that no one can know or memorize completely. Like, I just looked stuff up. I really just searched for list of sexualities, and I found such a thing as abrosexual, which apparently just is when your sexual attraction changes over time. Like, maybe today you are more attracted to men, and then tomorrow or even just some hours later you feel more attracted to women, or the next day maybe you feel asexual, but then 3 days later you are attracted to men again. And you could say, I mean, really, is that really its own sexual orientation? Like, you say that you are asexual, but only sometimes, only on some days. Isn't that true for anyone? What does that have to do with actual asexuality, where you are not interested in sex at all? I think anyone is asexual at times. If by asexual we mean having no interest in engaging in sex at that time. I mean, I have days where I'm not very interested in sex. That doesn't mean that I would say I'm an asexual, even at those days. And if you say that one day you are more attracted to men, one day you are more attracted to women, aren't you just bisexual with maybe changing attractions or changing appetites? Like, I mean, bisexual means that you like both men and women. Probably for any bisexual, it is true that they don't like both equally, or that they don't like both always equally much, but maybe have changing tastes and appetites. Maybe any bisexual at some point is more into men, or then maybe the other day is more lusting after women. I mean, that's like saying our eating habits, right? I don't eat the same dish every single day, but I don't treat that as a changing identity. Just because today I am having an appetite for tomatoes, and tomorrow I feel like, nah, I ate enough tomatoes yesterday. I really am not into tomatoes today. I would rather eat, I don't know, potatoes. I don't say that my overall taste has changed, that today I am not a tomato person, but rather I would probably still say that in general I like tomatoes, just today I feel like eating something else. So is abosexual really a sexual identity that needs to exist, we could ask? Or I I read that there's something like being demisexual, which means being not into women or into men in general, but rather only experiencing sexual attraction sometimes towards some women or some men, or only experiencing sexual attraction when you also have romantic feelings. So not being interested in random hookups, but only being into someone you actually like. And here too, you could ask, is that really different from just being heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual? Isn't that just being hetero or homo or bisexual while having taste? I mean, aren't we all demisexual in a way? I mean, just because I generally say that I like women doesn't mean that I want to jump into bed with every single woman on this planet, and that I'm attracted to every single woman there is. I too am selective in my attraction. So is that really its own sexuality? Or I read that there's such a thing as gray sexual, which apparently means only being interested in sexuality and only feeling attraction sometimes, which again, isn't that true for everyone? Like, surely some people have a stronger libido and some people less so. Maybe one person feels sexual attraction every day, but not 24 hours a day. So still not all the time, but every day, while another person may feel attraction only once a year. Sure. But then, if that means that that second person is gray sexual and that first person isn't, where do you cut that off? Like, if I only feel sexual needs once a year, I'm gray sexual. What if I feel them only once a month? Is that still gray sexual? If yes, what about once a week? Is that still gray sexual? And if so, then where's the cutoff? So if someone has interest in sex every third day, he's still gray sexual, but every second day he's no longer gray sexual. Again, this goes to show there's always a continuity. You can't draw clear borders with such things. You can't say, oh, this is gray sexual, this is not gray sexual. You can't say, oh, this guy is attracted to women only, and this guy is not attracted to women. Maybe the guy who's attracted to women secretly has some small attraction to men. Maybe very feminine looking men. Maybe men who maybe biological men who identify as women and dress the part, but still maybe he's not completely 100% heterosexual, even if he tells himself maybe. And here too, the point is that in such a debate, no side is correct and no side is incorrect in a way. Or rather, they are both incorrect if they treat their position as a fact. And that's what's done in this debate, right? Both sides tend to feel very strongly about this. Like, you have people coming up with their own sort of sexual or also gender identity that is so specific, so impossibly specific that there are maybe 3 people on Earth who fit this identity. Like, maybe you are saying, I only like biological females who identify as male and who have green hair and pink colored nails, and I only like them on Tuesdays, and this is my sexual identity. And now you give that its own name, its Latin or Greek name, and now you come up with its own flag. All these sexual identities have their own flags. You come up with this own flag for your sexual identity. And on the other hand, you have people saying, isn't it enough that there are gay people and there are heterosexual people, and if you like someone who's biological female and you yourself are male, then you are heterosexual. I don't care if you like her only on Tuesdays. You like women, that's it. I don't care if she identifies as a man. You like people with a female body, and that's it. I don't care if she has green hair or another hair color. You like women, and that's it. Well, both are positions you can take. There is no one position that is right and one that is incorrect here. Because, again, these terms, these sexual or these gender identities, they are not just descriptions of an objective reality existing independently of us. There are no such things as abosexuals or gray sexuals. But then there are no such things as heterosexuals or homosexuals either. I mean, that too is an arbitrary division. That is already a specification, because I could apply homogeneity even more. I could say, just like I say, I don't care if you feel sexual attraction to all women or only to women you are in love with. The latter doesn't make you demisexual. If as a man you like women, then you are heterosexual. I could say that, sure. But I could also say, I don't care if you like women or men. It both makes you sexual. I could say all people have the same sexuality, which is not heterosexuality or homosexuality or bisexuality, but just sexuality. I mean, they all have that in common, that they have some sort of sexual feelings and sexual attractions. So I decide, this is deeply idealistic. This is exactly where Kant's transcendental idealism applies to life. I can decide which perspective I assume, and I should be aware of my own decisions, my own free decisions on how to approach life, and I should make them as conscious decisions. The problem with people on both sides of these debates is that they want to deny their own freedom and their own responsibility, as unaufclared people always do. They don't want to be perpetrators, they want to be victims. So they either say, I am this sexuality, this is my identity, I didn't make it up, this is valid, I just discovered what I am, but this is me. And on the other hand, they say, no, you just made up this sexuality. There is no such thing as this identity you claim to have. There are only, let's say, two sexualities. Both are equally wrong as long as they think they are speaking of an objective material reality. And both are equally right as long as they are saying this is a perspective you can assume. You can't treat everything as homogeneous. So you can't say there are two big cultures or there are two sexualities. You can even say there's one. There's one sexuality, there's one humanity. But you can also specify as much as you want. You can also say, no, there is no such thing as Abrahamic religion. There are different faces. And then you can also say there's no such thing as Christianity. There's Catholicism and Protestantism and Orthodox Christianity. And there's also not Protestantism, because there are Lutherans and Calvinists and so on. And if you go down further and further, you will find there are probably no two people on earth who have the exact same faith. So in that way, you could say everyone has his own faith, his own religion. And likewise, between these two poles, between total unity and total disunity, you always have discontinuity. You always have links filling in the gap. You always have middle forms. You always have cases that are that don't fit neatly into one box or the other. No matter how specific two boxes are that you create, you will still find something that is sort of between them. Even if you make up two different sexualities, that one likes women only on Tuesdays and one likes them only on Wednesdays, you will still somewhere find a guy who likes them at midnight between Tuesday and Wednesday. And even if you make up, even if you say there are two countries here and they are different from each other, you will still find someone living at the border between them. And even if you go to the smallest level, even if you say, oh, people here in this building on the third floor in this flat, this family living there is different from the family living one floor above them, you will still find that maybe the parents of both families had an affair, and maybe there's someone living in that one family who is actually the son of the father of the other family and has something in common with him. We decide which boxes we create. We decide how big or how small we want to make these boxes. And no matter which boxes we create, there will always be some individuals which don't fit perfectly into one box or another, but which fall between them into their own sort of box, if you want. But coming back after this digression or this application to Kant himself. So, what he is saying, what is the conclusion of the critique of pure reason, is that the intellect, with its concepts and the principles derived from that, is constitutive for our cognition, while reason, with its ideas and the principles derived from that, is only regulative. But as regulative, it still has an important function. What Kant is saying here is that we can make synthetic judgments a priori that are objectively true, as long as they are about the condition of the possibility of making experience, as are the principles of the intellect. But then there are synthetic judgments a priori that are not objective, but subjective. That is the principles of reason, which I'm discussing here, because they are not about the condition of the possibility of making experience, but about the condition of the possibility of understanding experience, right? Without these principles of reason, we could still make experience, we could still experience a world in which we are, but we could not really make sense of the world. So all thinking, as I said in previous lectures, tries to bring unity into the manifold, tries to bring a synthetic unity. The intellect does that in a threefold manner, through apperception, apprehension, and then through intellection, through its concepts. All of this I discussed in previous lectures. And here Kant shows that reason too does bring synthetic unity, but not into the object of our cognition, that is the world which we are experiencing. Rather, if we think that reason with its ideas can bring synthetic unity into that, like if we think that reason really can prove, for example, one first and final cause, that is just a chimera. Their reason is dialectical. But reason does bring synthetic unity not into the object of cognition, but into the mode of cognition. So it brings synthetic unity into our own way of making and seeking cognition and experience of the world. The intellect is enough to immediately understanding the things that we deal with, because the intellect, as I previously explained, is the faculty of concepts, of rules. Through it, we understand which rule a given object in the world follows. And reason is not needed for understanding the world as such, but reason has a heuristic function, Kant says, because it doesn't teach us about the attributes of things, about the way things are, but it teaches us about the way we should inquire into things and into their attributes, about the way we should try to understand the world better. It is a transcendent and therefore wrong and dialectical use of our reason to use these ideas, like the idea of God, for example, to go beyond experience, to think that we can prove that there really is a God who is the first and one cause of everything. But it is an immanent use of our reason, and therefore one that is allowed, Kant says, to say, I am taking this idea of God, of a first cause of everything, and I will leave it open whether there really is such a thing or not, but I will look at the world, at my experience, as if it all came out of one common source. Whether that's God, whether that's the Big Bang, doesn't even matter, but I will try when examining the world, when making inquiry, when doing natural science, I will try to go back to this first source. Not because I really can prove that there is one, but I will try still to get as close to it as possible, because that will help me probably finding new facts about nature and how nature works. That will probably be a good heuristic principle to follow. So that is the actual conclusion of the critique of pure reason. We can only use our thinking in an immanent way. So when it is about this sensual world that we experience, we cannot use it in a transcendent way. And our intellect, we can use in an immanent way objectively. Its categories and the principles that spring from them have objective reality for us as conditions of the possibility of making experience at all, while we can make use of our reason in an immanent way, in a subjective way, guiding us. As the intellect brings unity into our sensuality, guiding us in bringing unity into our thinking. But the ideas of reason don't have an objective reality that can be proven. Rather, they are such guidelines. They are, as Kant says, concepts of limitation that limit our experience and tell us where to look for borders of that experience, even if we can never reach or even go beyond those borders. And I just want to add, as one last thing, that the concept of a thing in itself is also such an idea of reason, which doesn't have actual constitutive reality, but only a regulative function. If you think about it, it's very clear. It is a concept, right? It's a thought. It's something we talk about. But if you ask, where does Kant get this concept of a thing in itself from? Well, clearly it's not an empirical concept, because the very definition of a thing in itself is that which is not part of experience, that which is independent of our experience. Clearly, that's not a concept I got from experience. It's a concept I have a priori. But it is not one of the intellect's concepts. It's not one of the categories. And it is not a concept that is necessary in order to make experience, which can clearly be proven from the fact that most people don't have this concept, at least not consciously. Most people are not transcendental idealists. They don't make the distinction Kant makes between appearances and things in themselves, and still, despite that, they can make experience. The thing in itself is a concept of reason. It is an idea. Like any idea, in it there is expressed a totality, a maximum, which precisely for that reason could never possibly be experienced. It is the idea of a maximum of objectivity, so to say. Something that is completely independent of the subject which views that object, which is pure object, which exists not for us, not for some subject, but only for itself, which goes completely beyond experience. And again, exactly for that reason, like any maximum, like any idea, it couldn't possibly be experienced. So clearly, the thing in itself is an idea. And like the other ideas, Kant says, we cannot prove that it really exists. That would be, if we try to do that, then again, we would make a transcendent use of our reason. We would try to go beyond the appearances, beyond the sensual world, and to prove that something supersensual really exists. Rather, this idea of a thing in itself, in Kant's transcendental idealism, serves a regulative function. It serves the function of reminding us that these things that do appear to us are just that. They are appearances and not things in themselves. So we mustn't treat them as such, because if we do, we make errors. Then our reason again becomes dialectical. Um, but rather, we must be mindful of the fact that they are only for us, that they are only our representations and our consciousness, and that nothing that ever could be in my consciousness could ever be more than a representation, could ever be a thing in itself. That is the function that this idea serves. Once again, it's a heuristic function, and all ideas have such a regulative function. They regulate, they guide, if we understand them correctly and use them correctly, then they regulate and guide how we approach experience and how we try to understand experience. But if we take them to be more, if we take them to be constitutive concepts of a higher, supersensual, metaphysical world that we can know anything about, then we are deceiving ourselves. That is the result of Kant's critical inquiry. And with that, I'm closing off my talking of the critique of pure reason and of what Kant has to say about theoretical philosophy. And I want in the next weeks to turn to the second faculty of our mind, that is the faculty of pleasure and displeasure, and what Kant says about this faculty, and more specifically, what he says in the critique of the power of judgment about the beautiful and the sublime as special kinds of pleasurable feelings. My deep thanks be to my supporters, Thomas Deuringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.